Welcome to the first detailed metagame breakdown. This series is meant to give more context to the Banlist decisions by explaining the competitive landscape at the time. I will be taking data from the top 8 decks in each tournament, with the deck list for the winning deck and a sample deck list for each unique deck featured in the top 8. There will be some inaccuracies, because the data is 15 years old, and perhaps the archives are incomplete. A lot of the deck lists are invalid, and I think this one in particular has a typo, with the ritual Blackluster Soldier being played instead of the effect monster. If you're interested in more comprehensive coverage, I would suggest the exhaustive series Magnitude Gaming is working on. With all that out of the way, let's start looking at Shonen Jump Orlando, which was populated entirely by Chaos variants. Although Chaos is a bit of a broad descriptor, as cookie-cutter Chaos decks were loosely defined by light and dark monsters, and of course, the heavyweight Blackluster Soldier Envoy at the beginning, which was played alongside and later replaced by Chaos Sorcerer when BLS was banned. Tech cards in the monster lineup are Blade Knight, which has the potential for disabling flip effects, DD Warrior Lady for banishing monster removal, Genzo for trap suppression, and Kaiko the Ghost Destroyer for graveyard disruption, likely against other Chaos decks. The spell and trap support is pretty much a who's who of the ban list in this deck. I believe Sakuretsu Armor is the only card in the spell and trap lineup to have not hit the ban list. The basic game plan of this deck is to win through card advantage, then attacking with monsters when the opponent is out of resources. It has a solid grind game, and this sort of deck is the soul of GOAT format. In the defensive archetypes, it is much easier to name decks when there are not 30 staples and 10 tech cards in otherwise homogeneous decks. Shonen Jump Columbus had a similar showing, entirely of Chaos variants, some of which have been labeled as Warrior Beatdown and Chaos Hybrid. Here's the winning deck, with the standout tech cards being DD Assailant and even more copies of Sakuretsu Armor. Reinforcement of the Army is a very good tutor for the Warrior Removal Suite, and I understand why these decks are sometimes called Warrior variants, a term I will be using later after much of the actual Chaos monsters have been replaced. There is another similar deck, this time labeled as Earth Beatdown, maybe because of the Blackluster Soldier ritual monster. Other new tech is Danzalug to deplete the opponent's hand, Bottomless Trap Hole for banishing 1-for-1 removal, and sometimes even better when multiple monsters are special summoned simultaneously, like with Return from the Different Dimension. On that note, I have a theory that Return from the Different Dimension and Solemn Warning were not widely played because the life point cost is just so intimidating. But the other side of that coin is that the cards are never dead, since you can always pay half your life points. The true power of Return from the Different Dimension will be realized with Dad Return, but I am getting ahead of myself. Moving on to Shonen Jump Las Vegas, the top 2 decks were zombie variants, with the winning deck being a zombie chaos deck. The zombie affix comes from the inclusion of a small zombie engine, with Pyramid Turtle being able to tutor for itself, Spirit Reaper, and Vampire Lord, a single copy of Book of Life to recur zombies, and to disrupt the opponent's graveyard. I understand only a single copy of the card, because it requires both a zombie in your grave and a card in your opponent's grave, meaning that the card can be dead in hand. Dust Tornado is a solid spell and trap removal option, since the limitation of Mystical Space Typhoon, but otherwise, nothing outside the orthodox cookie-cutter build. Placing in the same event was a Beast Tech deck, which had the notable inclusions of Berserk Gorilla as a beat stick, Tiger King Wanghu as a floodgate against small monsters, and Nimble Momonga for swarming and stall tactics. One of the benefits of Nimble Momonga is tribute fodder for high-level monsters, like Genzo and the new edition, Mobius the Frost Monarch, which offers strong spell and trap removal. Up next is Soul Control, which also takes advantage of the new monarchs, with the inclusion of Mobius and Thestalos. The soul portion of the name comes from Soul Exchange, which helps to tribute summon the high-level monsters. The Apprentice Magician, Magician of Faith, and Hand of Nifs engine offers a bit of search and special summon, with Magician of Faith recurring spells, and the Hand of Nifs tutoring the Sacred Phoenix of Nifs. Lightning Vortex for mass removal, and Royal Decree for blanket trap negation round up the tech cards. Masks of Suku is the last unique deck in this tournament, which has been quite diverse in naming at the very least. This is a flip effect centric deck. We see Apprentice Magician and Magician of Faith returning, with the addition of Old Vindictive Magician, which offers a bit of monster removal. Night Assailant is another flip effect monster removal option, but it can also retrieve other flip effect monsters from the graveyard. Mask of Darkness recurs traps similar to Magician of Faith, and alongside Tsukiyomi forms the name of the deck. Tsukiyomi can flip the flip effect monsters back face down, essentially giving them another chance to activate the effect. Combine this with a nasty card like Time Seal, and you have something reminiscent of the Yatagarasu lock. There is a good amount of discard cards, like Back to Square One and Phoenix Wing Windblast, which are fueled by Sinister Serpent and Night Assailant, which, when you have one in hand and one in grave already, can act as unlimited discard fodder. On top of that, there is Messenger of Peace to stop attacking, and Solemn Judgment to stop everything. This deck must have been annoying to play against, but I think it was ahead of its time. The top deck of Shonen Jump Houston is a modified beatdown deck, with the tech of the aforementioned Berserk Gorilla. Goat Slayer Air Knight Parshath, which deals piercing battle damage and draws a card each time it inflicts battle damage. Spirit Reaper for defense and hand disruption, and Metamorphosis to access the Fusion deck toolbox. Benkai OTK is a deck which uses Armed Samurai Benkai, which gains an additional attack for each spell equipped to it. Iron Blacksmith Kotetsu searches for the strongest equipped spells at the time, with heavy hitters like a Scapegoat-boosted United We Stand, Mage Power, Axe of Despair, and Big Bang Shot to add piercing damage, which helps to get around your opponent's defense position monsters. Giant Grenade bounces back row, or even your own equip spells if you have already equipped them to a different monster. Clearing back row is pretty important to set up your OTK, even if you go -1. The final unique deck is the Answer, which is an anti-meta deck, or, I guess, the answer to a cookie cutter meta. Dan Zalug and Spirit Reaper are good hand disruption. Exiled Force and Injection Fairy Lily are spot removal, Mystic Tomato is a flexible tutor, Spell Canceller shuts down spell cards, and Mirror Wall to dissuade your opponent from attacking. When there is something like a Tier 0 format, decks like the Answer make sense, and I like it a lot. Shonen Jump Charlotte was dominated by more cookie-cutter decks, with the champion having a few new tech cards. Asura Priest is a good option for taking out a field of weak monsters, especially goat tokens. Creature Swap synergizes with your own goat tokens as an option to trade for a more useful monster. Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted are good options for monster resurrection, and Ceasefire is a combination of anti-flip effect tech with a little burn damage on top of it. The zombie deck runner-up plays the familiar Pyramid Turtle, Spirit Reaper, Vampire Lord, and 2 copies of Book of Life, which, on top of 3 Books of Moon, is a lot of heavy reading. Giant Rat is a good tutor, especially for Exiled Force. And Morphing Jar is very strong cycling, which digs deeper into the deck and can dump zombies from hand to grave, ready for reanimation. Shonen Jump New Jersey was another tournament dominated by the cookie-cutter Chaos Control decks, and a single copy of Enraged Battle Ox, adding piercing battle damage, does not go too far to differentiate the top deck from what we've seen before. Shonen Jump Seattle has a strange first place deck. I am thinking that Guardian Chaos, without a way to summon it, is a typo of some sort, but I am pretty clueless as to what it was supposed to be. Super secret tech? Maybe? Winning US Nationals is a familiar goat-like control deck. This deck was originally titled just Thousand Eyes, but the inclusion of Gravekeeper Spy and Guard make it stand out a little bit more than goat decks. Gravekeeper Spy tutors for itself and the Guard, which are both well-statted flip effect monsters and solid defensive options for the time. At Shonen Jump Indianapolis, the Chaos Affix is dropped, and this is the first deck labeled as Goat Control. Magic Cylinder is a cheeky attack negation and burn damage card, but the only new card to talk about in this deck. More interesting was what might be the first showing of an actual archetype with Gravekeepers. Triple Assailant, Triple Spear Soldier, Triple Spy, Triple Necro Valley, and Triple Rite of Spirit is probably enough to say that this is not an engine, but an actual Gravekeeper's deck. Necrovalley is good graveyard disruption and can be searched with terraforming. Rite of Spirit is monster resurrection, which ignores the restrictions of Necrovalley, and there's a single copy of Solemn Judgment for good measure. The last unique deck in Indianapolis was a burn deck focused around Wave Motion Cannon. There is a heavy flip effect lineup, with Magician of Faith to recur spells, notably the Wave Motion Cannon itself, Night Assailant to function as removal and to recur other flip effect monsters. Then new cards like Cyberjar, which does quite a lot, is a board wipe, then digs 5 cards deep into the deck to special summon or set applicable monsters, then adding the remaining spells and traps to hand. Magical Merchant has a similar function, excavating cards from the deck until a spell or trap is revealed, then adding it to hand. This digs deeper into the deck and can dump monsters into the graveyard. Descoal rounds out the flip effect monsters with burn damage, which gets better the more cards in your opponent's hand, which they might have quite a few of after the effect of Cyberjar resolves. BLS and Air Knight Parshath are still in the deck because they are just that good, offering a big tempo push and card advantage. Metamorphosis is a key card as well. Being able to get out Thousand Eyes Restrict off of a goat token locks down the battle phase, and can stall until the Wave Motion Cannon hits critical mass. Spell Shield Type 8 is there to function as Magic Jammer when needed, like to protect the cannon, but also as 1-for-1 spell negation when the option comes up. The Cookie Cutter Chaos decks, which topped Shonen Jump Boston, double down on face down hate, with 2 copies of Air Knight Parshath and 1 copy of Exarian Universe to inflict piercing battle damage. Brain Control is a scary new face. Being a slightly watered down Change of Heart, the card is still really good. And finally, Different Dimension Capsule makes an appearance, which is a very slow and cumbersome tutor, taking multiple turns to add the card and risking the card remaining banished face down if the capsule leaves the field. Still, in a time of minimal spell and trap removal, and a slow format, this card makes some sense. Shonen Jump Boston is a bit of a tipping point, as the Chaos decks have been waning in popularity in favor of Warrior decks. Shonen Jump Championships Chicago was topped by a Different Dimension Warrior variant. Although the Chaos Sorcerer might mean that this is a Chaos deck, since the term is so nebulous. Triple DD Assailant, Single DD Survivor, and Single DD Warrior Lady is more like a suite than an engine or archetype. Mystic Tomato is the toolbox tutor of choice, with a notable target being Nudoria, which is 1-for-1 battle-based monster removal, as well as Don Zalug and Spirit Reaper for hand disruption and potential stalling. This is the first appearance of Cyber Dragon, which is such a strong tempo card and can even be tribute fodder for a first turn Monarch. There is more spell and trap removal with Triple Dust Tornado, and even a little more monster removal with Smashing Ground. Also featured in SGC Chicago was an early Monarch deck, featuring double Mobius, Thestalos, and Zaborg, along with Soul Exchange to complete the suite. Gravekeepers also serve as tribute fodder, and the new tech Dikoichi the Battle-Chanted Locomotive is draw power. And although slow by today's standards, draw power is still win power. Widespread Ruin is more monster removal, although My Body as a Shield also makes an appearance, useful in countering cards like Widespread Ruin. Minnesota Regionals was topped by a Warrior aggro deck, with the first mention of the aggro strategy. While control decks tend to grind out longer games and win through attrition, aggro decks focus on special summoning sometimes weaker monsters, but overwhelming the opponent with a dominant board position. In this case, Triple Cyber Dragon is probably behind the aggro affix, which is played alongside the DD and discard suites. New tech is Mystic Swordsman level 2 to deal with face down monsters. It is important to note that this card can be searched with reinforcement of the army. Maybe I was too harsh on this one. Also sneaking into Minnesota Regionals was a couple zombie decks, which are inexplicably labeled as Chaos decks as well. There's a 6-card zombie suite, with Pyramid Turtle being able to special summon Regenerating Mummy and Ryu Koki. Regenerating Mummy is a little defense against discard strategies, since it will summon itself when sent to the graveyard from hand by the opponent's card effect. Ryu Koki is tech against warriors and spellcasters, which are easily the two most common monster types in the metagame so far. Jinzo and Royal Decree explain the otherwise light trap lineup, because this deck really dislikes trap cards. Shonen Jump Atlanta was entirely warrior decks, and very similar ones at that. The most interesting new tech is a copy of Legendary Jujutsu Master, which can bounce a monster and set the opponent back a draw, especially useful against tribute monsters. Another deck from the tournament adds Marauding Captain, which is a good aggro card, being able to summon an extra monster from hand, with the captain having a tiny bit of inherent protection as well as Sasuke Samurai, which is more searchable anti-face down tech. Shonen Jump San Francisco is the last event of the year topped with a Warrior Toolbox deck, which is almost entirely composed of cards already covered. But Pot of Erebus is new, offering monster recycling and draw power in a longer game. It is also interesting to note that Sangan, perhaps the strongest monster searcher not yet banned, was not an auto-include. The last deck is another burn deck, which draws from the Wave Motion Cannon deck, but adds even more damage potential. Lava Golem and Stealth Bird are heavy hitters, but giving your opponent a big monster might not be the best idea. So there is a ton of battle suppression, with Messenger of Peace, Swords of Revealing Light, double Level Limit Area B, and double Gravity Bind. This also helps to protect the flip monsters and allow for Stealth Bird to inflict damage every turn. Ojama Trio helps to increase the damage potential of Just Desserts and Secret Barrel, and only 2 Just Desserts seems a little light. Additionally, Ceasefire and Poison of the Old Man round out the burn cards. This is a little before the time of Chain Burn, with Chain Strike being printed the following year, but you can see the deck beginning to come together. Time to look at the overall data for the year, and keep in mind that the naming convention for decks is loose at best. The majority of the metagame was Chaos decks, with the largest share being Warrior variants, followed by Zombie decks, Burn decks, and a couple decks in the other category. It is pretty obvious that the game was dominated with a couple dozen power cards, which might recontextualize some of the complaints of a homogeneous metagame in the Age of Archetypes. But that is just for the main decks. Extra deck diversity was wild. Pretty much anything that can be cheated out with Magical Scientist or Metamorphosis. Side deck diversity is through the roof as well. This is a good example of question and answer design, where a strategy in the meta has several efficient counter strategies, and I am just going to go through some of the main threats in the format, and how they might be averted or even punished in games 2 and 3. I will try to avoid repeating myself because a lot of the cards have already been featured in the main deck section, but the sheer number of interesting tech cards is so remarkable. Still, I know I won't be able to resist. But first, I want to get the more generic floodgates out of the way. With Tiger King Wanghu, Jinzo, Royal Decree, and Spell Canceller already covered, Prohibition is a standout, which essentially bans one specific card named by the player. Royal Oppression is a bit ahead of its time, but shutting off special summoning, even if it is somewhat symmetrical, is always valuable. Curse of Darkness is a pseudo-floodgate that dissuades the activation of spell cards, but does not prevent their activation. On the same note, Curse Seal of the Forbidden Spell and Divine Wrath are common negation options, stopping all copies of a spell and monster effects respectively. Although Solemn Judgment is also a very strong card in that category. But if it can't be negated, what about destroyed? Spell and trap removal is also pretty basic, with cards like Mobius the Frost Monarch and Dust Tornado. Giant Trinade is a dangerous card when you bounce your own spells, but it is a decent option to bounce back row for an OTK. Chiron the Mage can destroy spell and traps, but has the steep cost of discarding a spell from hand. The stat lineup is very respectable for the time, just to point out a benefit that might be otherwise overlooked. Swarm of Locust is a pseudo-flip effect monster which can reset itself, and can pop a spell or trap each turn, which makes it a good inclusion in a control deck. One copy of Nobleman of Extermination made its way into a side deck, which is a card that I am not sure many people were even aware of. This counterpart to Nobleman of Crossout hits face-down spell or traps, and in the case of traps, banishes all copies from both players' decks. Underrated, in my opinion. Speaking of Nobleman of Crossout, the variety of viable options to deal with face-down monsters is astounding. Ceasefire and Swords of Revealing Light flip face-down monsters without activating flip effects. Windstorm of Edequa sort of fits that role as well, shifting the battle position of every monster on the field. Royal Command just shuts down the flip effects of monsters. As for monster-based removal, we have already seen Mystic Swordsman level 2, but there's another card with a better stat line, although it is not searchable with reinforcement of the army, Drillroid. And then, to preemptively deal with threats, a few more hand disruption cards enter the fray. Chain Disappearance to banish all copies of a weak monster, Mind Crush to deal with a known problem card, and the nasty Trap Dust Shoot, which can cherry pick a problem monster from hand. And, as with any question posed, there are answers in the side deck too. Elephant Statue of Disruption burns the opponent for 2,000 damage when discarded. Electric Snake is a precursor to Brow the Huntsman of the Dark World, but still draws 2 cards when discarded. Neko Mana King is an even harsher penalty though, because it will end your opponent's turn when sent to the graveyard by their card effect. And I guess Penguin Knight is here too, uniting the graveyard and deck when milled. In addition to Kuriboh, there is another early hand trap being experimented with. Gravekeeper's Watcher is an underrated but narrow hand trap, which counters cards that cause your opponent to discard cards, and is something to remember in Dark World metas, which will be coming in the future. Finally, in this category of more specific threats is effect damage. Hallowed Life Barrier is expensive in terms of card advantage, but protects from both battle and effect damage. Peruku's Circle of Enchantment is another good option, which does not have that discard cost. Barrel Behind the Door not only prevents effect damage, but reflects it back at your opponent. And then there is Death's Wombat, which shuts down effect damage on a decently statted monster. Definitely a consideration for my next underrated Floodgate Monsters video. Then, when dealing with battle damage, Waboku, Magic Cylinder, and even Kuriboh are options which saw competitive play. Detailed meta-analysis videos like this take a good amount of time to research, and there is so much that I had to leave out for time constraints, focusing on cards which saw play rather than individual duelists' performance. This series, alongside the history of the Banlist videos, might just detail the majority of cards which saw competitive TCG play at one point or another. There is more data available for later years. Starting somewhere around 2010, there are more available statistics on the most popular cards played at the time, more accurate data about tournament reports, and alongside the adoption of archetypes, it will definitely be fun to examine a more complex metagame in future videos.